In the quiet hours, when the world thins out and the present begins to loosen its grip, it can feel easier to listen for older echoes, not the loud kind, the ones that arrive like a slow tide, carrying silt and starlight, carrying names that were once spoken under oil lamps and reed roofs. Tonight, you do not need to solve anything. You only need to drift near the edge of a question that has been waiting a very long time. A question pressed into clay, hardened by fire, and carried across centuries by accident, by ruin, by careful hands, by dust. So let your breathing settle into an unhurried rhythm. Let the room become a safe distance away. And when you are ready, we will step into a library made of broken tablets and unfinished sentences, and follow a trail that seems to lead toward a war the gods could not prevent. There are places in the world where history does not feel like a timeline, but like a sealed room. A room stacked high with clay tablets, each one carrying a small portion of a voice that never expected to be heard by us. In those rooms, silence is not emptiness. It is storage. It is waiting. If you feel yourself easing into the story, and you want a quiet way to return to this kind of listening again, you can subscribe, like leaving a small candle in the window of time, not as a demand, only as a gentle invitation to come back when the night is kind. In one such collection, a fragment can change the temperature of everything around it, not because it proves a conclusion, but because it introduces a sentence that does not behave like myth. It is brief, clinical, almost administrative, as if the scribe were noting a shipment or a boundary marker. And yet the meaning tilts the mind. A line that suggests conflict not against chaos, not against monsters, but among the divine names themselves. War upon themselves. Not a metaphor for thunder, not the seasonal quarrel of sky and soil. Something internal, political, and lethal. Fragments like that do not stand alone for long. Once you notice a pattern, your eyes begin to find it everywhere. A complaint here about councils that could not agree. A lament there describing a city collapsing as if its protective order had been withdrawn. A hymn that praises a deity for victory that sounds less like poetry and more like a bulletin from the aftermath. When you line up the texts across regions and centuries, the story does not assemble into a clean narrative. It assembles like a shoreline after a storm. Pieces of wood, pieces of pottery, a single sandal, a shard of glass, enough to suggest the shape of the disaster without handing you the comfort of certainty. And so we begin where the evidence actually lives, in the material world. Clay, reeds, seals pressed into wet surfaces, signs shaped like wedges, small decisions made by a hand that wanted to be precise. This is what makes Mesopotamia feel different from so many other ancient worlds. Their voices survived not because they were carved into mountains, but because they were pressed into something ordinary. The same clay that built their walls also held their memory. A fired tablet can outlast an empire. A fired tablet can outlast a language. It can outlast the people who made it, and still keep their fears intact. The land that produced these records was not gentle. Between the great rivers, life depended on managing water that could either feed you or erase you. Cities rose where canals could be maintained, where labor could be coordinated, where grain could be stored and redistributed. When we look at those cities, we see bricks, foundations, temple platforms built and rebuilt on the same sacred footprint, generation after generation, as if the ground itself were being taught to remember. And somewhere inside that long repetition, the texts insist on another kind of continuity. They insist that the gods were not distant abstractions. They were administrators with rivalries, households, territories, and decisions that had consequences. The name Anunnaki moves through these tablets like a recurring shadow. Sometimes it means the great ones of the divine assembly. Sometimes it means those who authorize, those who judge, those who hold the right to decree. The point is not the exact count or the neatness of the definition. The point is the tone. These are not beings described as purely symbolic. They eat, they argue, they threaten, they bargain, they take sides. And when the texts speak of disaster, they do not always blame human failure. Sometimes they blame a fracture in the governing order above. If that sounds strange, let it sound strange slowly. We are not here to force modern categories onto ancient sentences. We are here to watch how the ancient sentences behave, to notice what they emphasize, what they repeat, what they refuse to explain. In that refusal, a different kind of truth can hide. Not necessarily a literal account of gods with weapons, but a preserved memory of collapse, of competing authorities, of a world that felt supervised until it suddenly did not. And so the question takes form, quiet but unavoidable. If the Sumerians and their heirs remembered a time when divine factions turned against each other, what did that feel like on the ground? What would a final war look like to a farmer, to a temple worker, to a scribe whose job was to keep records even as the sky changed color? And if the tablets are not a single story but scattered witnesses, how do we listen to them without pretending they are tidy? We listen the way you listen at night, to a distant storm that might be moving closer, counting the seconds between flash and thunder, waiting for the first unmistakable sign that the air itself has decided. The idea of a divine war only becomes unsettling when it begins to behave like history. Not heroic clashes carved in relief, not symbolic battles between light and darkness, but sequences of cause and effect that resemble institutional failure. Councils convened, decisions made, orders issued, consequences recorded, and then, afterward, the language of grief, confusion, and abandonment. What survives in the tablets is rarely the spectacle itself. It is the aftermath. Cities described as emptied of sound. Fields that no longer answer the plow. Temples standing but uninhabited, as if the presence that once animated them had withdrawn without ceremony. The scribes do not say the gods vanished in anger or ascended in glory. They say the gods left, or more precisely, that their seats were vacated. The phrasing matters. It is administrative, not theological. When Sumerian and Akkadian lamentation texts describe destruction, they do so with an almost uncomfortable restraint. They list gates broken, canals clogged, storehouses burned. They name neighborhoods and cardinal directions. The tone is not mythic exaggeration. It is inventory after catastrophe. This is one of the reasons scholars have struggled with these texts for over a century. They do not behave the way myth is supposed to behave. They do not soften the blow with symbolism. They do not moralize consistently. They report. And then there are the phrases that refuse to sit quietly inside academic footnotes, descriptions of lands rendered uninhabitable for generations, of soil that produces sickness, of air that kills birds mid-flight. These lines are rare, fragmented, and easy to dismiss when taken alone. But across multiple compositions, separated by geography and time, they repeat with slight variations, like a memory retold by different witnesses who never compared notes. The temptation is always to jump ahead, to imagine weapons and battles, to project modern fears backward. But the texts themselves move more slowly. Before there is war, there is disagreement. Before disagreement, there is structure. And before structure, there is a reason it was needed in the first place. According to these records, the world of the gods was not born stable. Authority had to be negotiated, labor had to be assigned, resources had to be managed. The Anunnaki appear less like eternal archetypes and more like a ruling class overseeing a system that required constant maintenance. When that maintenance failed, pressure built. When pressure built, decisions followed. and when decisions were contested, the system strained. This is where humanity enters the story, not as a moral experiment but as an economic solution. The texts are surprisingly candid about this. Humans are created to take over work the gods no longer wish to perform. Canal digging, field clearing, construction, the tasks that sustain cities but exhaust bodies. In this framework, humanity is not an afterthought. It is infrastructure. For a time, the solution works. Cities expand, surplus increases, temples grow rich. The divine order appears stable enough to endure. But stability in these texts is always provisional. It depends on balance, and balance, once disrupted, does not quietly return. Noise becomes a problem. Not metaphorical noise, but density, activity, the hum of too many lives concentrated in too little space. The gods complain not of sin, but of disturbance. Sleep is interrupted. The administrative tone returns. A problem is identified. Solutions are proposed. Escalations follow. Plague, drought, famine. Each one a corrective measure that fails to fully solve the underlying issue. When the flood is authorized, it is not framed as justice. It is framed as reset. And that distinction will matter later when the consequences of that decision ripple outward in ways the Council does not appear to have anticipated, because one of them refuses to comply. Quietly, procedurally, without open rebellion but with absolute intent. That refusal fractures something fundamental. Authority is shown to be divisible. Orders can be undermined. Survival can be engineered even when annihilation is decreed. After the waters recede, the world is smaller, quieter, and permanently altered. Lifespans shorten. The distance between gods and humans grows, and trust once broken at the highest level does not repair itself easily. If there was a final war, it does not begin with fire falling from the sky. It begins here, with disagreement over whether the system itself should continue, with one faction willing to erase its own solution, and another unwilling to watch that erasure happen. From this point forward, every conflict recorded in the tablets carries an aftertaste of that choice. Every theft of authority, every divided council, every city destroyed not by foreign armies, but by forces that seem to arrive from above and within at the same time. And so, before we look at weapons or battlefields, we have to sit with the uncomfortable possibility that what the Sumerians remembered was not a war of gods against monsters, but a collapse of governance, a breakdown in the mechanisms that once held the world together. If that is true, then the final war was not sudden. It was the last stage of something already failing. The collapse of governance leaves a particular kind of trace. Not a single scar, but a pattern of small, compounding failures that only make sense when viewed together. In the Sumerian world, those failures were recorded not as accusations, but as observations. A canal that no longer delivered water on schedule. A temple that received offerings but no longer responded. A city whose protective deity was said to have turned away, not in anger but in absence. The language used for divine withdrawal is careful. The gods do not die. They depart. They abandon their cities like administrators reassigned, leaving behind structures that still stand but no longer function. In later lamentations, this absence is described as more terrifying than invasion. An enemy army can be fought or appeased. An empty temple cannot. When the god leaves, the city becomes porous to disaster. Storms arrive without warning. Enemies cross borders unchallenged. Crops fail for reasons no one can correct. This is where the idea of a final war begins to sharpen. Not as a single event, but as a sequence of departures following conflict. The texts hint that divine presence was not uniform across the land. Some cities remained protected longer than others. Some were favored by one faction, while others fell under another's hostility. The political geography of the gods begins to overlap uncomfortably with the political geography of human settlements. When we read that one city was destroyed while another was spared, the reason is rarely moral. It is relational. Whose city was it? Which god claimed it? Which side of a divine dispute it fell on? This is not how modern theology is usually structured, but it is how ancient bureaucracy behaves. Loyalty determines protection. Affiliation determines fate. The gods themselves are not immune to consequence. In several texts, divine figures express fear, regret, or exhaustion after destructive decisions. This is not omnipotence, it is authority constrained by process. Councils vote. Decrees are sealed. Mechanisms are activated that cannot easily be stopped once set in motion. When the flood terrifies even the gods who ordered it, the implication is clear. Control is partial. Outcomes exceed intention. After the flood, the world does not reset cleanly, it limps forward. Humans survive but diminished. The kings who follow rule for shorter spans. The connection between heaven and earth becomes more regulated, more distant. The gods communicate through intermediaries, through dreams and signs, rather than direct presence. Something has been lost, and the texts do not pretend otherwise. It is in this altered world that the conflicts intensify. Authority becomes more valuable because it is no longer secure. Symbols of power take on greater importance because consensus has failed. Whoever holds the right to decree reality holds everything. And when that right can be stolen, challenged, or reassigned, stability becomes temporary by definition. The tablets describe this struggle through stories of theft. Not petty theft, but the seizure of legitimacy itself. An object that represents the power to command, to decide outcomes, to fix the structure of the world. Each time it changes hands, chaos follows, laws fail, commands lose force. The universe hesitates, as if waiting to see which voice it should obey. From the human perspective, these shifts are experienced as disaster. Crops fail because the seasons no longer align. Cities fall because protection has been withdrawn. Disease spreads because boundaries have broken down. The texts do not tell us that humans understood the divine politics behind these events. They only tell us that humans recorded what happened when order dissolved. This is why the final war is never narrated in full. There is no single tablet that says, this is when it began, and this is when it ended. Instead, there are laments written after cities burn, hymns praising victory that feel defensive, myths that try to reassert hierarchy in a world that has already seen it collapse once. And beneath all of it runs a quieter question. If the gods could fight among themselves, if their authority could fracture, if their decisions could produce unintended devastation, then what exactly was humanity living under? A stable divine order, or a system as fragile as any other, just operating on a scale large enough to feel eternal? The Sumerians never answer that question directly. They leave it suspended, pressed into clay, waiting for someone else to notice the tension and carry it forward. That tension becomes clearer when we stop looking for a battlefield and begin looking for procedures. The Sumerian imagination, at least as preserved in its texts, is procedural to the core. Power is exercised through decrees. Decisions are sealed. Authority is authenticated. When something goes wrong, the question is not who is evil, but which process failed. This is why the object later called the Tablet of Destinies matters so deeply. It is not described as a weapon. It does not strike or burn or shatter. It authorizes, it legitimizes. In a culture where written records define ownership, obligation, and law, the idea of a master tablet that confirms ultimate authority is not mystical at all. It is the logical extension of their administrative worldview. Whoever holds it can make decisions that reality itself is obligated to follow. When the texts describe this tablet being stolen, the consequences are immediate and systemic. Commands no longer function. Hierarchies freeze. The cosmos hesitates, not because it is confused, but because it no longer recognizes a valid seal. This is not chaos in the sense of wild disorder. It is paralysis, a system waiting for credentials. The thefts are never random. They are always political. A subordinate challenges a superior. A rival faction exploits a moment of vulnerability. Authority is seized, not to destroy the system, but to control it. And each time, the resolution requires force, not persuasion. Negotiation has already failed by the time the tablet changes hands. From the perspective of those living below, these struggles manifest as environmental and social collapse. The texts do not say, the tablet was stolen, therefore the crops failed. They say, the crops failed, the city burned, the god departed. The causal chain is implicit, not explained. But it repeats often enough to form a pattern that would have been obvious to those who inherited the stories. This is where the idea of a final war becomes unavoidable, not because the texts describe a last battle in vivid detail, but because they describe an escalation that never fully resolves. Each crisis ends with authority restored, but never stabilized. The possibility of future theft remains. The system survives, but weakened. Trust has eroded. Precedent has been set. The gods themselves seem aware of this fragility. In later compositions, there is an almost anxious insistence on hierarchy. Kingship is emphasized. Loyalty is praised. Rebellion is framed as existential threat. These are not the themes of a confident order. They are the themes of one that has already seen what happens when legitimacy fractures. For humanity, this instability creates a strange inheritance. Humans are no longer just laborers. They become stakeholders in a broken system. Their cities rise and fall not only because of their own actions, but because of disputes far above them. Their suffering becomes collateral in conflicts they cannot influence and barely understand. This is why the laments are so important. They are not prayers for forgiveness. They are records of abandonment. They describe gods leaving their temples, turning away from their own cities, as if the bond itself had been damaged. Once broken, it could not simply be restored by offerings or obedience. If there was a final war, it may not have been final because it ended everything. It may have been final because it changed the rules. After it, divine presence becomes rarer, authority becomes more centralized. Human kings take on roles once attributed to gods, enforcing order through law rather than proximity. And that transition carries its own unease. Because if the gods withdrew not in triumph but in failure, then the world that follows is not protected by design. It is managed by necessity. The ancient texts do not celebrate this shift. They endure it. As we move forward, the question deepens. What kind of conflict leaves behind administration without presence, ritual without certainty, and memory without resolution? And what does it mean that the oldest written civilization we know remembered its gods not as eternal victors, but as participants in a system that could break? To understand why the system broke, we have to look at what strained it long before the first city fell silent. The tablets insist on this point with quiet persistence. Conflict did not arrive from outside the divine order. It emerged from within it, from pressures that accumulated over time and were managed just well enough to delay collapse. At the center of those pressures is labor, not as metaphor, but as reality. The gods of the earliest texts are not depicted reclining in effortless abundance. They are depicted organizing, supervising, assigning work, and growing tired of it. The younger gods, tasked with maintaining the physical infrastructure of the world, dig canals, raise embankments, and keep the land productive. This work is endless. It must be repeated every season, and eventually, it becomes intolerable. The revolt of the younger gods is described with striking clarity. They do not whisper complaints. They act. They destroy their tools. They surround the dwelling of their overseer. They force a crisis. The language used is political, not cosmic. This is a labor uprising, complete with demands and consequences. The senior gods are not offended by blasphemy. They are alarmed by the possibility of civil war. The solution they reach is pragmatic and chilling. Create a new workforce, one that can absorb the burden without threatening the hierarchy. Humans are not created as companions or worshippers. They are created as replacements. The texts say this without apology. Humanity exists to stabilize a system that was already under stress. For a time, this works. The younger gods are relieved. The senior gods retain authority. The system recalibrates. But the cost is deferred, not eliminated. Humans multiply faster than expected. Cities grow dense. The labor solution becomes a demographic problem. The same efficiency that made humanity useful makes it disruptive. Noise becomes the symptom, but not the disease. Noise is what the gods notice, but population is what drives it. The world becomes crowded. The infrastructure strains again, this time not from divine laborers rebelling, but from human ones exceeding the system's tolerance. And once again, the response is procedural. Identify the problem, apply corrective measures, escalate when those measures fail. The flood is the most extreme escalation, but it is not the first attempt. It is simply the last one that can be imagined within the existing framework. Erase the surplus, reset the balance, restore quiet. What the Council fails to account for is the precedent it sets. Once total destruction is authorized, dissent becomes meaningful in a way it was not before. Enki's refusal matters not because it saves humanity, but because it exposes a flaw in the structure of authority. A decree can be undermined. A unanimous decision can be quietly subverted. The system is no longer absolute. It is contingent on cooperation, and cooperation, once broken, cannot be assumed again. After the flood, the texts describe a world that feels watched less closely. The gods impose new limits rather than new presence. Lifespans shorten. Fertility is regulated. Mortality becomes a tool of governance. These are not the actions of a confident order. They are the controls of one that has learned its reach exceeds its stability. This is the world in which the later conflicts unfold. A world where authority exists, but trust does not. Where symbols of power become essential because consensus has eroded. Where theft, rebellion, and seizure of legitimacy are no longer unthinkable, but expected risks. If there was a final war, it was not born from ambition alone. It was born from a system pushed beyond its design limits, from solutions layered on top of solutions until the structure could no longer bear its own weight. And when it finally gave way, what fell was not just cities or gods, but the assumption that the order governing the world was unbreakable. Once the assumption of permanence is broken, every decision carries a shadow. The texts written after the great catastrophes feel different from those that came before. They are more cautious, more insistent, more concerned with lineage, legitimacy, and proper succession. It is as if the memory of near collapse has been folded into the structure of every subsequent story. The gods do not disappear after the flood. They reorganize. Authority is redistributed. Roles are clarified with new urgency. But beneath this reordering is an anxiety the earlier texts do not share. The system has learned that it can fail, and a system that knows this becomes defensive. This defensiveness shows up most clearly in the obsession with who has the right to rule. Kingship is no longer just a function. It is a sacred transfer, a thing that descends, that must be received correctly, that can be revoked if misused. The language of destiny hardens. Fate becomes something written, sealed, and enforced, rather than assumed. In this climate, symbols of authority take on immense weight. A throne is no longer furniture. A crown is no longer ornament. A tablet is no longer record. They become anchors of reality. Without them, the world risks slipping back into the uncertainty it barely survived. The stories of stolen authority reflect this fear. When the tablet of destinies is taken, the crisis is immediate because it threatens to reopen wounds that never fully healed. The cosmos does not fall into chaos because it is fragile. It falls into chaos because it remembers what fragility feels like. These narratives also reveal something uncomfortable about divine power. It is not unlimited. It is procedural, conditional, and vulnerable to disruption. The gods cannot simply will stability into existence. They must maintain it through correct process. And when that process is interrupted, even they are bound by the consequences. For humans living within this world, the result is a strange mixture of closeness and distance. The gods are still present enough to be feared, but no longer close enough to be relied upon completely. Ritual becomes more elaborate. Omens become more important. Divination becomes a way to compensate for the loss of direct certainty. This is also when memory begins to change shape. Events that may have been experienced as political or environmental disasters start to be encoded as cosmic struggles. Not because the people misunderstood what happened, but because myth becomes the only language large enough to carry the emotional weight of loss across generations. A city destroyed by fire is tragedy. A world destabilized by a fracture in divine authority is trauma. Trauma does not pass cleanly from parent to child. It distorts. It repeats. It embeds itself in stories that circle the same themes again and again, trying to resolve what cannot be resolved. The final war, if it occurred, may have been remembered not as a single sequence of battles, but as a long unraveling. A period when authority was contested repeatedly, when cities aligned with different divine patrons, when protection shifted unpredictably, and when survival depended on standing in the right place at the right time. From this perspective, the war is not located in one year or one region. It stretches, it migrates, it expresses itself through multiple crises that feel connected even when the details differ. Fires here, floods there, abandonment in one place, sudden favor in another. The tablets do not tell us when the war ended because endings are rarely clear to those living through collapse. What they tell us instead is what followed. A quieter world, a more distant sky, a human order forced to stand on its own legs more often than before, and a lingering sense that something vast had passed through history, leaving behind structures that still bore its weight. As the sky grows more distant in the later texts, the earth grows heavier. Responsibility settles downward. What was once attributed to divine presence now has to be managed through human systems. Law codes appear. Boundaries are surveyed. Contracts are sealed with care. These are not signs of progress alone. They are signs of adaptation after loss. The memory of divine instability lingers like a fault line beneath everything built afterward. Kings rule, but they rule nervously. Their authority is described as granted from above, yet their actions suggest they know that grant can be withdrawn. They build temples not only to honor the gods, but to anchor them, to persuade them to remain. A god who stays is a god who protects. A god who leaves is a city already half destroyed. This anxiety is woven into the architecture. Temples rise on layered platforms, rebuilt again and again on the same sacred footprint, as if depth itself might persuade continuity. Each rebuilding is both devotion and insurance. The message is subtle but persistent. Stay here. Remember us. Do not turn away. Yet the texts also acknowledge that gods have their own conflicts, their own priorities, their own failures. Human piety does not guarantee divine cohesion. A city can be faithful and still fall if its patron loses standing in the larger order. This is perhaps the most unsettling idea preserved in the tablets. That righteousness is not protection when authority above is divided. When later scribes look backward, they do not frame the ancient catastrophes as punishments for sin alone. They frame them as consequences of disorder. When hierarchy collapses above, the collapse cascades downward. The laments speak less about guilt and more about bewilderment. Why did the god abandon us? What decree was made elsewhere that sealed our fate? This perspective changes how war itself is remembered. The final war is not glorified. It is not heroic. It is mourned as the moment when certainty died. After it, the world still functions, but it does so with visible strain. The seasons still turn, but they are less predictable. Authority still exists, but it must constantly be reinforced. The repetition of conflict myths across centuries begins to make sense in this light. They are not entertainment. They are rehearsal. Each retelling reasserts a hierarchy, restores authority, punishes rebellion. Each one attempts to convince both gods and humans that order can still hold, that the system, though shaken, is not doomed. But repetition can also signal doubt. When a culture must repeatedly assert stability, it may be because stability is no longer felt. The stories grow louder where confidence has grown thin. The insistence itself becomes evidence of what is feared. In this atmosphere, even memory becomes contested. Different cities preserve different versions of the past. One god emerges victorious in one tradition, diminished in another. Lineages are rewritten. Alliances are emphasized or erased. History becomes another terrain of conflict, shaped by those who survive and those who rule afterward. If the final war truly marked the end of an age, its most enduring legacy may not be destruction, but reinterpretation. The past is reorganized to make sense of the present. The gods are arranged into cleaner hierarchies. The messiness of earlier conflicts is smoothed over or pushed into fragmentary myths that only hint at what once happened. And yet, the fragments remain. A line about poisoned land. A lament about a god who would not return. A story about authority stolen and barely recovered. These are not accidents. They are the places where memory resisted editing, where something too large, too disruptive, refused to be fully absorbed into a reassuring narrative. As we continue, the question shifts again. If the final war reshaped not only the world, but how the world remembered itself, then what else might be hidden in the way these stories were told? And what might still be visible if we learn how to listen to what the tablets are reluctant to say outright? Listening to what the tablets avoid saying can be as revealing as listening to what they repeat. Silence, in these texts, is rarely empty. It is deliberate. Certain moments are passed over quickly. Certain outcomes are implied but not described. Certain names appear at the edges of stories and then vanish, as if the scribes knew exactly where not to linger. This is especially true when the texts approach the limits of acceptable memory. Events that challenge the legitimacy of the divine order are handled carefully, wrapped in allegory or displaced onto monsters and rebels. A god who oversteps becomes a demon in later retellings. A political rival becomes a force of chaos. The narrative smooths itself, but the seams remain visible if you look long enough. The final war seems to occupy this uneasy space. It is everywhere and nowhere at once. Its presence is felt in the sudden density of lamentations, in the emphasis on restoration myths, in the repeated insistence that order has been reaffirmed. Cultures do not reaffirm what they have never seen threatened. There is also a change in scale. Earlier stories are intimate. Gods walk among cities. They eat offerings. They argue face to face. After the great ruptures, the gods grow larger and farther away. Their conflicts become cosmic. Their movements shape heaven and earth rather than individual streets. This inflation feels like distance turned into narrative form. For humans, this shift alters identity itself. No longer participants in a shared system with visible overseers, people become subjects of a more abstract authority. Fate is no longer negotiated. It is decreed. Destiny is written, not discussed. This is comforting in one sense. A written fate cannot argue, but it is also final. The memory of earlier proximity does not vanish completely. It survives in stories of ancient kings who spoke with gods, of heroes who challenged divine limits, of times when the boundary between mortal and divine felt thinner. These stories are tinged with loss. They describe a world that once allowed negotiation, now replaced by one that demands submission. If the final war marked the withdrawal of that negotiable order, then its true ending was not an explosion, but a closing. A door that no longer opened. A council that no longer convened in the same way. Authority hardened, distance increased, and humanity adjusted, because adjustment is what survival requires. This is why the tablets feel so modern at times, not because they describe technology or machines, but because they describe systems under strain. They describe governance failing. They describe emergency solutions that create new problems. They describe populations caught between decisions made far above them and consequences felt immediately below. As we move deeper, the question is no longer whether there was a final war. The question becomes how such a war would be remembered by those who could not see it directly. What language would they use? What metaphors would survive? And how much of that memory would be allowed to remain intact once the world demanded reassurance more than truth? The answers are not written in a single place. They are distributed across centuries, across cities, across fragments that were never meant to be assembled. But when we begin to place them side by side, a shape starts to emerge. Not sharp, not complete, but unmistakably human in its attempt to remember something that changed everything. Once a memory is fragmented, it does not disappear. It migrates. It settles into new forms, attaching itself to different names, different gods, different catastrophes. The later the text, the more indirect the reference, as if the event itself had become too large to face head-on. What remains is structure, repetition, pattern. This is where cosmology begins to absorb history. The organization of the universe mirrors the organization of power. Heaven is layered. Authority descends through ranked levels. Decisions flow downward, consequences upward. When the system functions, harmony prevails. When it fractures, the entire cosmos feels unstable. This is not abstract philosophy. It is lived experience projected onto the sky. The Anunnaki, once described as present rulers of specific cities, begin to merge into broader categories. Sky gods, storm gods, wisdom gods. Their individual conflicts blur into archetypes, yet the old tensions remain encoded within these roles. The storm god still destroys. The wisdom god still circumvents. The sky god still authorizes but rarely intervenes. These are not random traits. They are narrative residues of earlier disputes. Humanity, too, is reinterpreted. No longer merely laborers, humans become caretakers of memory. Priests and scribes inherit the burden of maintaining alignment between heaven and earth. Ritual becomes a technology. Sacrifice becomes maintenance. If the gods are distant and divided, then precision matters. One wrong word, one incorrect offering, one missed festival. The system might slip again. This is why astronomy grows in importance. The sky becomes a schedule. The movements of stars and planets are read as signals of divine intention, not because the gods are poetic, but because predictability offers comfort. If the heavens move in cycles, then perhaps history does too. Perhaps catastrophe can be anticipated. Perhaps the final war was not an ending, but a phase. The idea of cycles begins to dominate. Ages rise, ages fall, floods reset, fires purify. Nothing is truly final. Even endings are folded into recurrence. This does not erase fear, but it contains it. A cyclical universe promises return, even if return is painful. In this framework, the final war becomes the closing of one cycle and the opening of another. The age when gods ruled directly gives way to the age when humans rule in their name. Authority is inherited, not embodied. Memory replaces presence. Writing replaces voice. The tablets themselves embody this shift. Earlier texts feel immediate. Later ones feel archival. They reference older sources. They copy and preserve. They curate memory rather than generate it. This is the work of a culture that knows something has been lost and is determined not to lose it entirely. And yet, no amount of preservation can restore what is gone. The war, whatever its precise form, accomplished one irreversible thing. It changed the relationship between humanity and the powers it believed governed the world. The gods were no longer neighbors. They were principles, forces, distant arbiters whose conflicts echoed faintly through storms and seasons. As we move forward into the heart of these cosmological interpretations, we are no longer asking what happened, but how meaning was rebuilt afterward, how a shattered order learned to speak again, and how the echoes of that rebuilding still shape the way we imagine beginnings, endings, and the fragile space in between. Rebuilding meaning after collapse requires distance. The closer one is to disaster, the harder it is to explain. So, the later texts step back. They elevate events into cosmic time, placing them beyond the reach of ordinary memory. What was once a crisis becomes a precedent. What was once chaos becomes structure. This is how cosmology becomes a shelter. By embedding catastrophe into the design of the universe itself, the trauma is given context. If destruction is part of a cycle, then it is no longer a failure. It is a phase. The heavens rotate, the ages turn. Even gods rise and fall within a larger rhythm. Nothing is immune, but nothing is meaningless either. The ordering of the cosmos described in Mesopotamian texts reflects this need for reassurance. The universe is no longer simply inhabited by gods. It is administered. Domains are assigned. Boundaries are fixed. Responsibilities are clarified. The language of governance expands upward, as if the sky itself has been bureaucratized to prevent another collapse. Yet traces of the older world persist. The gods still argue. Alliances still shift. Authority still requires confirmation. The difference is that these conflicts are now framed as necessary struggles rather than existential threats. War among the gods becomes a means of re-establishing order, not a sign that order is fragile. This reframing is subtle but profound. Earlier texts describe conflict as disruption. Later ones describe it as correction. A rebellion is crushed. A usurper is defeated. Authority is restored. The narrative reassures the listener that the system works, even when it must defend itself violently. But reassurance often hides anxiety. The insistence that order always returns suggests an awareness that it might not. The repeated emphasis on rightful kingship, proper succession, and legitimate authority reads like a response to a memory that refuses to fade. Something once broke badly enough to require constant narrative repair. Humans internalize this lesson. Kings model themselves after gods, not because they believe themselves divine, but because divine authority has become a template for governance. Law codes mimic cosmic order. Punishments reflect divine judgments. Justice is framed as alignment with a higher decree rather than communal agreement. This alignment offers stability, but it also limits imagination. When authority is defined as descending from above, resistance becomes rebellion against the cosmos itself. The memory of divine civil conflict makes such rebellion terrifying. If even the gods could fracture the world, what might humans do? And so obedience becomes virtue. Continuity becomes sacred. Change is approached cautiously, wrapped in ritual and justification. Innovation survives, but it must disguise itself as restoration. New orders claim ancient origins. New rulers trace their lineage to old gods. The past becomes a resource to legitimize the present. The final war, reframed through this lens, becomes a warning embedded in the structure of belief. Do not allow authority to fracture. Do not permit competing decrees. Do not forget what happens when legitimacy is contested. The lesson is not told directly. It is encoded in every story that ends with order barely restored. As we continue, we move closer to the moments where this warning becomes explicit, where the texts no longer hide their concern behind cosmology, but speak plainly about cities erased, lands rendered barren, and a fear that what happened once could happen again. When the texts speak plainly, they do so in the language of loss. Not speculative loss, but named loss. A city is listed. A gate is mentioned. A canal is described as choked with debris. These details anchor the narrative, preventing it from floating too far into abstraction. They remind the listener that whatever cosmology later absorbed, something tangible was destroyed. The lamentation tradition is especially revealing here. These compositions are not myths. They are ritualized grief. Sung or recited after catastrophe, they preserve the memory of collapse with painful precision. The gods are addressed directly, accused gently, pleaded with desperately. Why did you abandon your city? Why did you turn away? Why did you allow this to happen? What is striking is that the laments do not describe punishment. They describe absence. The gods are said to have withdrawn their presence, leaving the city exposed. This distinction matters. Punishment implies intent directed at humans. Withdrawal implies a decision made elsewhere for reasons that may have nothing to do with the city itself. In some laments, the gods themselves are depicted as complicit yet helpless. They argue in councils. They attempt to intervene. They fail. The destruction unfolds anyway, as if set in motion by forces that cannot easily be recalled. The image is unsettling. Even divine authority, once exercised, cannot always be undone. This sense of inevitability deepens the impression that the final war was not a single act, but a process, a sequence of decisions whose consequences cascaded beyond anyone's control. Once authority fractured, once decrees were contested, the machinery of the world continued turning, grinding cities and lives in its path. There are moments in these texts where the violence feels almost technological, not because machines are named, but because the destruction is described as impersonal. Fire that does not behave like ordinary fire. Wind that does not bring relief. Water that does not recede when expected. The natural world itself seems misaligned, as if its governing instructions had been altered. Later interpreters would struggle with these passages, often softening them into metaphor. But the original tone resists comfort. It insists that something went wrong at a fundamental level, not just morally, structurally. For those who lived through such times, explanation mattered less than survival. Memory, however, did not forget. It carried forward the sense that the world could become hostile without warning, that protection was conditional, that even divine systems could misfire. This is why later traditions place such emphasis on appeasement, precision, and repetition. Ritual becomes a way to reassure both gods and humans that alignment still exists, that the channels between heaven and earth, though narrowed, are not completely severed. The final war, in this light, becomes the last moment when those channels were dangerously open, when conflict above spilled freely below. Afterward, barriers rise, distance increases, communication becomes formalized. The world grows quieter, safer perhaps, but also lonelier. And yet the memory persists. In every lament, in every warning, in every story that begins with order and ends with its near loss. The tablets do not let us forget that stability is not the natural state of things. It is an achievement, one that must be maintained or risk being undone again. As the memory of instability hardens into tradition, the role of the survivor becomes central. Those who rebuild after catastrophe do more than reconstruct walls and canals. They reconstruct meaning. They decide which memories are safe to preserve and which must be reshaped to allow life to continue. This selective remembering can be felt in the way later texts handle blame. Earlier compositions are blunt about disagreement among the gods. Later ones grow more careful. Conflict is displaced onto outsiders, monsters, or abstract forces. Divine unity is emphasized, even when earlier records suggest it was anything but unified. This is not deception in the modern sense. It is adaptation. A fractured cosmos is harder to live under than a dangerous one. Yet the older memory never disappears entirely. It remains embedded in contradictions. A god praised for order in one text appears as the source of destruction in another. A city once described as favored later becomes an example of abandonment. These inconsistencies are not errors, they are scars. The scribes who copied these tablets were not neutral archivists. They were participants in a long recovery. Their work preserved the past, but it also filtered it. What we inherit is not raw history, but history processed through generations of survival. That makes the persistence of certain themes all the more significant. Again and again, the texts return to the idea of excessive action, too much noise, too many people, too much disruption. The response is always to restore balance, not to seek justice. This reveals a worldview shaped by systems thinking rather than morality. The problem is imbalance. The solution is correction. In this framework, war among the gods becomes the most dangerous form of imbalance. It threatens the very mechanisms designed to maintain order. It undermines the legitimacy of decrees. It destabilizes the environment. It exposes humanity to consequences it cannot influence. The final war, remembered through this lens, becomes a boundary event, a line drawn in memory between a time when divine conflict was visible and a time when it was hidden behind cosmic order. After it, the gods still act, but their actions are filtered through layers of mediation. The raw force of their disagreement is no longer allowed to reach the surface so freely. Humans adapt by internalizing control. Law replaces proximity. Kings replace gods as immediate authorities. Writing replaces direct command. This is not progress in a simple sense. It is compensation, a way to function in a world where certainty has been lost. The anxiety that drives this compensation is quiet but pervasive. It surfaces in omens carefully recorded, in rituals repeated exactly as prescribed, in the fear of deviation. If alignment is lost again, the consequences could be catastrophic. And so the memory of the final war becomes less about what happened and more about what must not happen again. Its details blur, but its lesson sharpens. Do not allow authority to fracture. Do not allow competing decrees. Do not forget how close the world came to unraveling. As we move forward, We will see how this lesson is carried into later civilizations, reshaped again and again until it becomes almost invisible. And yet, beneath layers of myth and ritual, the same quiet warning continues to pulse, waiting for a moment when someone listens closely enough to hear it. When a warning is repeated long enough, it becomes part of the background. No longer questioned, no longer examined, it simply hums beneath culture like a distant engine. By the time later civilizations inherit the memory of Mesopotamia, the final war has become less an event than an assumption, a sense that the world once broke and that its repair required limits. Those limits shape everything that follows. Power must be centralized, authority must be singular. Multiplicity is dangerous. Rival claims invite disaster. These ideas harden into doctrine, not because they are philosophically elegant, but because they are remembered as necessary for survival. This inheritance travels quietly, from Sumer to Akkad, from Akkad to Babylon, from Babylon outward into neighboring worlds. Each culture adapts the memory to its own needs, its own gods, its own fears. The names change, the structure remains. Where earlier texts spoke openly of divine disagreement, later ones compress conflict into a single decisive struggle. A champion rises. Chaos is defeated. Order is established once and for all. The narrative simplifies, not because reality became simpler, but because complexity had proven dangerous. And yet, even in these streamlined myths, traces of the older anxiety remain. The champion must be granted authority before acting. Consent must be unanimous. Power must be legitimized. These ritualized moments of agreement are echoes of a time when agreement failed. The earth, too, carries memory. Layers of ash, sudden abandonment of cities, gaps in occupation where life simply stops and then resumes generations later. Archaeology records these silences without explanation. The texts attempt to fill them, but never completely. This is where speculation begins to whisper, not loudly, not insistently, just enough to be noticed. When stories describe destruction that feels impersonal, when land is said to be poisoned, when recovery takes longer than expected, the mind searches for analogies, for frameworks that can make sense of such descriptions. The ancient writers did not have our language for technology or radiation or environmental collapse. They had only metaphor, observation, and memory. Fire that burns without flame, wind that kills, water that does not cleanse. These phrases are not explanations. They are impressions. Whether they reflect literal events, symbolic trauma, or a mixture of both is ultimately less important than the fact that they were remembered at all. Something happened that exceeded ordinary experience. Something that could not be comfortably integrated into existing cosmology without reshaping that cosmology itself. The final war, in this sense, may have been less about who fought whom and more about what kind of force was unleashed. A force that disrupted not only cities, but assumptions. That made the gods seem fallible. That made the world feel less predictable. If so, then the withdrawal of the gods is not just narrative, it is psychological. When protection fails once, trust does not fully return. Distance becomes safer than intimacy. Abstraction becomes safer than presence. And so the world moves forward with a quieter sky and heavier laws. Humanity learns to govern itself under the shadow of an authority that once fractured. The memory of that fracture becomes the unspoken reason for caution, hierarchy, and restraint. The question that now presses gently at the edge of the story is this: if the final war was remembered not in details but in structures, not in names but in rules, then what else might be encoded in the way ancient civilizations chose to organize their worlds? And what might that tell us about what they were trying, very carefully, not to repeat? The way a civilization organizes itself is never accidental. It is shaped as much by fear as by hope. When we look closely at the structures that emerge after the age of direct divine rule, we begin to see governance designed around prevention. Prevention of fracture, prevention of excess, prevention of another collapse that no one wants to name directly. Hierarchy becomes rigid. Authority flows in one direction. Disobedience is not merely illegal, it is dangerous. The memory beneath these choices is clear. Competing commands once tore the world apart. Unity, even harsh unity, feels safer than division. This logic extends beyond politics into cosmology itself. The universe is described as layered, ordered, sealed. Gates exist between realms. Permissions are required to cross them. Knowledge is restricted. Even the gods are bound by rules they did not create, but must obey. This is not the cosmology of carefree immortals. It is the cosmology of survivors. The role of the rebel shifts accordingly. Earlier texts could depict dissent within the divine council as tragic but understandable. Later ones demonize it. The rebel becomes a monster, a thief, a disturber of order. His defeat is necessary, not because he is evil, but because the system cannot tolerate another challenge to legitimacy. Yet rebellion does not disappear. It resurfaces in displaced forms, in stories of humans who seek forbidden knowledge, in kings who overreach, in cities that rise too fast. Each of these narratives ends the same way. The overstep is corrected. Balance is restored. The listener is reminded of the cost of excess. These stories function like cultural scar tissue. They protect, but they also limit movement. Innovation must justify itself as restoration. New ideas must claim ancient roots. The past becomes an anchor that prevents drift, even when drift might be necessary. At the same time, the memory of divine fallibility lingers in subtle ways. Omens are ambiguous. The gods do not always respond. Prayers go unanswered. This uncertainty produces a different kind of spirituality, one focused less on communion and more on alignment. The goal is not closeness, but correctness. For humanity, this marks a turning point. Responsibility can no longer be deferred upward. If the gods can disagree, withdraw, or fail to intervene, then humans must manage the world themselves, using the models they inherited. Law, ritual, and record-keeping become sacred because they are all that stands between order and chaos. The final war, then, recedes further into the past, but its imprint deepens. It becomes the invisible architecture beneath civilization, a remembered warning built into stone, text, and custom. A lesson learned so thoroughly that it no longer needs to be spoken aloud. And yet, silence has its own cost. What is not spoken cannot be examined. What cannot be examined cannot be fully understood. The ancient world chose stability over inquiry, survival over clarity. That choice allowed civilization to continue, but it also ensured that the deepest questions would remain unresolved. As we move onward, those unresolved questions begin to surface again, not in ancient temples, but in the modern mind. Because when we encounter these texts today, stripped of their ritual function and read as records of experience, the old unease returns, and we are left to wonder whether the final war was truly finished or merely buried beneath the structures it forced into being. When buried memories resurface, they rarely do so gently. They return as questions that refuse to settle, as patterns that feel uncomfortably familiar. Reading these ancient texts from a modern distance, stripped of the rituals that once contained them, we begin to sense why the final war was never allowed to be told plainly. Its implications reach too far forward. The fear encoded in these narratives is not fear of destruction alone. It is fear of repetition. The knowledge that systems collapse not because of external enemies, but because of internal fractures. That authority fails not when it is challenged from below, but when it is divided at the top. This is why the ancient writers were so careful with causation. They did not want to normalize divine failure, to say openly that the gods fought among themselves, that their decisions poisoned land and erased cities, would be to undermine the very framework that held society together. And so the truth, whatever it was, had to be preserved indirectly. Indirect memory has a particular texture. It speaks in metaphors that feel excessive. Fire that scorches without warmth. Wind that suffocates instead of refreshing. Water that destroys instead of renewing. These inversions hint at experiences that broke expectations so completely that ordinary language could not contain them. The modern mind is tempted to translate these descriptions into familiar categories: weapons, technology, environmental catastrophe. But even if such translations feel plausible, they are ultimately secondary. What matters more is how the ancients experienced the event, as something that violated the rules, something that did not belong in the world as they understood it. This violation is what makes the final war feel so different from ordinary conflict. It is not remembered as heroic, it is remembered as destabilizing. The problem was not who won, but what was broken in the process. The system that governed reality itself seemed to misfire. Afterward, the need to restore predictability became paramount. The sky had to be made reliable again. The seasons had to mean something. Fate had to be written, not argued. In this effort, ambiguity was dangerous. Stories were simplified. Authority was centralized. Memory was curated. Yet curated memory has limits. Fragments escape. A line here, a phrase there. Enough to suggest that beneath the calm surface of later cosmology lies a deeper turbulence. The more we compare texts across time and place, the more those fragments begin to align. The final war may never have been recorded as a single narrative because no single group experienced it in full. Different cities saw different consequences. Different gods took different sides. Survivors pieced together what they could from the ruins. What emerged was not a chronicle, but a constellation of memories orbiting a shared absence. That absence is where the war lives now, in the gaps between texts, in the sudden shifts of tone, in the insistence that order has been restored, repeated just a little too often. These are the fingerprints of something unresolved. As we move deeper still, we must begin asking a harder question, not what the final war was, but why its memory continues to resonate. Why, after thousands of years, these stories still feel uncomfortably relevant. And whether the ancient fear they preserve is not about gods at all, but about systems, power, and the fragile agreements that hold any world together. That relevance is difficult to ignore once it settles in. The ancient fear does not feel exotic, it feels familiar. The anxiety that authority can fracture, that decisions made far above can devastate lives far below. That systems designed to maintain order can become the source of catastrophe when they turn against themselves. The Sumerians did not have a word for systemic collapse, but they described it with remarkable clarity. When divine counsels failed, the earth responded. When decrees conflicted, reality hesitated. When authority was contested, the environment itself seemed to rebel. This is not superstition in the naive sense. It is an attempt to understand causality in a world where power was both visible and opaque. From this perspective, the gods function less as supernatural beings and more as embodiments of governing principles: storms, fertility, wisdom, war. Each represents a force that must be balanced against the others. When balance is lost, disaster follows. Whether the gods were experienced as literal entities or as personifications of complex systems matters less than the consistency of the pattern. The final war, then, may have been remembered as the moment when these forces ceased to cooperate, when the checks and balances failed, when one solution undermined another, when authority became fragmented enough that correction required destruction. What makes this memory unsettling is not its age, but its logic. The same logic appears whenever centralized systems grow too complex to manage. When authority becomes concentrated, dissent becomes existential. When dissent becomes existential, compromise disappears. When compromise disappears, escalation becomes inevitable. The ancient texts do not moralize this process. They do not blame ambition or pride in the modern sense. They present it as almost mechanical, a sequence of pressures and responses: labor revolts, population growth, environmental strain, administrative decisions, escalation, reset. This mechanical quality is what gives the descriptions of destruction their strange neutrality. Cities are erased not out of hatred, but necessity. The tone is cold because the logic is cold. Systems correct themselves without regard for individual suffering. After the final war, that logic is internalized. Humans begin to model their societies on what they believe the gods learned too late. Centralized authority, written law, clear succession, controlled growth. These measures are meant to prevent another collapse, but they also constrain life in new ways. The irony is subtle. In trying to avoid divine failure, humanity inherits divine anxiety. The fear of fracture becomes embedded in culture. Stability is valued above compassion, order above flexibility. The memory of collapse justifies harshness. This is why the final war remains such a powerful lens. It is not just a story about gods. It is a story about governance, scale, and unintended consequences, about how solutions create new problems, about how control, once lost, is pursued at any cost. As we continue, the focus shifts again, from the ancient world to the bridge between ancient and modern thinking, to the moment when these texts were rediscovered, translated, and read by people who no longer shared the assumptions that once contained their meaning, and what happened when a buried memory met a world ready to question it. When these texts resurfaced in the modern era, they did so without the ritual framework that once held them in place. The gods no longer lived in the temples. The laments were no longer sung to prevent further loss. What remained were words, pressed into clay, asking to be read by minds shaped by entirely different assumptions. This encounter was quietly destabilizing. Scholars approached the tablets expecting mythology, symbolism, poetic exaggeration. What they found instead were records that behaved like reports, lists, procedures, chronologies, complaints. The divine characters did not act like timeless archetypes. They acted like administrators under pressure. The problem was not belief, it was category. These texts refused to fit neatly into the boxes modern thought had prepared for them. They were too technical to dismiss as fantasy, too cosmic to classify as ordinary history. And hovering between those categories was the persistent suggestion of conflict at a scale that felt uncomfortably real. Early translators often softened this tension. Divine wars became symbolic struggles. Descriptions of devastation became metaphor. The idea that ancient people might have been recording memories of systemic collapse rather than inventing morality tales was difficult to accept. It threatened the boundary between myth and history, but the boundary kept blurring. As more tablets were translated, patterns became harder to ignore. The same anxieties appeared again and again. Authority contested, cities erased, land rendered unusable. Survivors struggling to explain why protection failed. These were not isolated themes. They were structural. What modern readers lacked was not intelligence, but context. The ancient world did not separate religion, governance, and natural forces into distinct domains. For them, these were different expressions of the same reality. To say a god was angry was to say the system governing rain, fertility, or war had shifted. Divine conflict was environmental conflict was political conflict. Seen this way, the final war begins to look less like fantasy and more like an attempt to describe cascading failure across interconnected systems. A breakdown in coordination that rippled outward until nothing remained untouched. The language is mythic because myth was the available vocabulary. The experience itself may have been brutally concrete. This does not require us to imagine gods with weapons in the modern sense. It requires us to imagine a society witnessing forces beyond its control, behaving unpredictably, violently, and decisively. Forces that had once been reliable. Forces that had names. The modern discomfort with this idea is understandable. It challenges the comforting assumption that ancient people simply invented stories to explain the world. It suggests instead that they observed, recorded, and remembered events that exceeded their explanatory tools. And so, the final war re-enters the conversation not as a claim to be proven, but as a question that refuses to go away. What happens when a civilization experiences collapse so severe that it must reimagine the structure of reality itself to survive it? As we move forward, that question follows us, not as an accusation, not as a prophecy, but as an invitation to listen more carefully to the texts, to the silences, and to the possibility that the oldest written memories we possess are not about the birth of civilization alone, but about the cost of almost losing it. Listening carefully requires patience, because the tablets do not rush. They circle their subject, approach it from different angles, retreat and return. This is not evasiveness. It is caution born of experience. When a memory has the power to destabilize, it must be handled slowly. One of the most striking features of these texts is how rarely they celebrate victory. Even when order is restored, the tone remains restrained. The aftermath matters more than the triumph. What was lost cannot be fully recovered. What was broken leaves a residue. Stability returns, but it feels provisional. This restraint suggests that the final war, whatever its form, was not experienced as a cleansing event. It did not solve everything. It imposed limits. It forced adaptation. The world that followed was workable, but diminished. The sky still turned. The rivers still flowed. But something fundamental had shifted. That shift is often described indirectly through changes in human condition. Lifespans shorten. Access to divine knowledge narrows. Communication becomes mediated. The texts do not frame these changes as punishment. They present them as adjustments, constraints introduced to prevent another catastrophe. From a modern perspective, this looks like the aftermath of a system pushed beyond safe operating limits. When recovery occurs, it is accompanied by safeguards, redundancies, restrictions, fail-safes. The ancient world expresses these concepts through myth because myth is the language of totality. It speaks to the whole system at once. The gods in this phase become guardians of boundaries rather than active rulers. They enforce limits. They punish transgression. They preserve order by discouraging excess. Their distance is not indifference. It is containment. Humans respond by internalizing these boundaries. Curiosity becomes dangerous. Overreach becomes taboo. The pursuit of immortality becomes a cautionary tale. Heroes who challenge limits suffer consequences that reaffirm the new order. These stories are not warnings against knowledge itself, but against destabilization. The memory of the final war thus shapes ethics, not through commandments, but through examples. Do not multiply without restraint. Do not challenge authority without cause. Do not assume protection is unconditional. These lessons are woven into narrative rather than stated outright. What is remarkable is how long these lessons persist. Long after the names of the Anunnaki fade, long after their cities are buried, the underlying anxiety remains. Civilizations continue to fear fragmentation at the top. They continue to associate unity with survival. They continue to see conflict among rulers as a cosmic threat. In this sense, the final war is not confined to Mesopotamia. It becomes a template, a remembered possibility that shapes political imagination across cultures and eras. The details change, the structure endures. As we move deeper still, we approach the point where speculation becomes unavoidable. Not reckless speculation, but careful inference. When patterns repeat across myth, ritual, governance, and memory, they invite interpretation. And the interpretation that emerges is both ancient and unsettling. That the greatest danger to any ordered world is not invasion, but division. Division, once named, becomes the quiet antagonist of the entire tradition. It is never personified directly, but it haunts every story. The fear is not of enemies beyond the borders, but of fractures within the center, of councils that no longer agree, of authority that speaks with more than one voice. This fear reshapes how time itself is understood. History is no longer a straight line of progress. It becomes a series of rises and corrections, advances followed by restraint, expansion followed by collapse. The final war is remembered as the most extreme correction, the point at which division forced the system to intervene against itself. In this world view, catastrophe is not random. It is reactive. A response to imbalance that has been allowed to grow too large. The gods do not destroy because they are cruel. They destroy because they are constrained by the same logic that governs everything else. When balance fails, reset becomes inevitable. This logic does not comfort. It explains. And explanation, in a world shaped by loss, is a form of survival. If destruction follows certain patterns, then perhaps it can be anticipated. Perhaps it can be delayed. Perhaps it can be mitigated. This is why divination becomes so central after the great ruptures. The future is no longer trusted to unfold smoothly. It must be read, interpreted, negotiated. Omens are collected obsessively. Signs are catalogued. The gods are distant, but their movements are believed to leave traces. Those traces become warnings. The irony is profound. In trying to avoid another divine conflict, humanity becomes hyper-attuned to divine intention. Every anomaly is scrutinized. Every irregularity is feared. The system grows more sensitive, not more relaxed. Stability requires constant vigilance. This vigilance shapes identity. Kings are judged not only by their success, but by their ability to maintain alignment. A good ruler is one who keeps the gods quiet. A bad ruler is one whose reign coincides with disaster. Cause and effect blur. Correlation becomes accusation. The final war thus continues to exert pressure long after its memory fades. It becomes the invisible standard against which all order is measured. As long as the world does not resemble that remembered chaos, the system is considered to be working. Yet this creates a paradox. By defining order as the absence of catastrophe, the culture becomes reactive. It does not ask what kind of world it wants to build, only what kind of disaster it wants to avoid. Creativity is constrained by fear. Stability becomes the highest virtue. This is the quiet cost of survival after collapse. The world continues, but cautiously. The sky is watched. The past is revered. The future is approached slowly, as if it might shatter under too much ambition. And still, beneath all this caution, the memory remains unresolved. The final war is never fully explained, never fully exorcised. It lingers as a question without an answer. What exactly failed? And could it fail again, even under different names? As we move toward the final arc of this story, the focus shifts from ancient gods to inherited responsibility. Because whether or not the Anunnaki were ever what the texts describe, the pattern they preserve is unmistakably human, and it is a pattern that does not belong only to the distant past. Inherited responsibility is the quiet theme that emerges once the gods recede far enough into memory. The ancient writers did not frame this inheritance as empowerment. They framed it as burden. Humanity inherits a world that has already nearly undone itself, along with the obligation not to repeat the conditions that led to that undoing. This obligation is never stated directly. It does not need to be. It is embedded in the architecture of civilization, in laws that emphasize continuity, in rituals that reenact order, in stories that warn against excess without explaining why excess is so dangerous. The reason is assumed. It has already been learned the hard way. The final war, as preserved in fragments and patterns, becomes less about divine actors and more about systemic memory. A civilization remembers what nearly destroyed it, even when it no longer remembers the details. That memory guides behavior long after belief fades. This is why the texts feel so restrained when they approach the edge of explanation. To name the failure too clearly would risk reopening it. To describe the war in full would risk legitimizing division. Silence becomes a form of protection. Yet silence also creates space. Space for interpretation, space for speculation, space for future generations to ask questions the past could not afford to ask. When the tablets are read today, they no longer serve the same stabilizing function. They become mirrors. In those mirrors, we see not gods at war, but the anatomy of collapse, authority divided, labor strained, environmental systems pushed too far, emergency measures escalating until correction becomes indistinguishable from destruction. These are not ancient problems. They are recurring ones. The calm, almost hypnotic tone of the texts is part of their power. They do not shout warnings. They imply them. They trust that anyone who listens long enough will hear the pattern beneath the names. That pattern is older than any single civilization and more durable than any one collapse. If there was a final war, its finality may lie not in ending the gods, but in ending innocence. After it, no system could assume its own stability. No authority could claim absolute immunity from fracture. The world became something that had to be managed, not simply inhabited. This is where the ancient narrative begins to open outward, beyond Mesopotamia, beyond the Anunnaki, beyond the clay tablets themselves. The story stops being about what happened then and starts being about what always happens when complexity outruns cohesion. And so, without urgency and without fear, the tablets hand the story forward, not as a prophecy, not as a warning shouted across time, but as a quiet record of what was learned once, at immense cost, and written down so it would not be completely forgotten again. Once the story passes from memory into inheritance, catastrophe is no longer an event. It becomes a reference point, a shadow against which every decision is measured, even when its origin has been obscured by time. This is the threshold where the narrative shifts from explanation to reckoning. The ancient texts suggest that the world after the great upheavals was not merely quieter, but constrained. Forces that once moved freely were bounded. Access was limited. Even the gods appear to operate within tighter margins. Their interventions become rarer, more formal, more conditional. The universe itself feels regulated. This regulation is often framed as protection. Boundaries prevent excess. Distance prevents conflict. But boundaries also prevent intimacy. The earlier world, for all its danger, allowed negotiation. Afterward, the rules are fixed. Fate is written. Appeals are possible, but reversals are rare. The language of destiny grows heavier in this period. What was once decided in council is now inscribed. What was once debated is now enforced. This shift suggests not confidence, but caution. A system that has nearly destroyed itself does not trust improvisation. In this environment, catastrophe no longer arrives as surprise. It arrives as confirmation. When disaster strikes, it is read as proof that alignment was lost somewhere. The search is not for cause, but for deviation. Someone failed to follow the pattern. Someone broke the seal. This way of thinking shapes how violence is understood. Destruction becomes corrective. War becomes cleansing. Flood becomes renewal. These interpretations do not deny suffering, but they subordinate it to necessity. Survival demands acceptance. The final war, reframed through this lens, becomes the ultimate correction, not because it was just, but because it was unavoidable once imbalance reached a certain scale. This does not absolve it. It contextualizes it within a worldview that prioritizes continuity over compassion. From the human perspective, this worldview is double-edged. It offers stability, but it also limits agency. If disaster is always the result of deviation, then dissent becomes suspect. Innovation becomes risky. Change becomes something that must be carefully disguised as restoration. This tension runs quietly beneath later civilizations. Empires rise, claiming to restore ancient order. Laws are justified by appeal to primordial precedent. The past is invoked not to inspire, but to constrain. Memory becomes law. Yet memory, no matter how controlled, is never complete. Fragments escape. Anomalies persist. Stories that do not quite fit the official pattern survive at the margins. They whisper of a time when authority argued, when the sky was closer, when outcomes were not yet sealed. These whispers matter because they remind us that the current order is not inevitable. It is chosen in response to fear, to loss, to a remembered collapse that no one wanted to repeat. Understanding this does not weaken the system, it reveals its origin. As we move deeper into the aftermath, the focus narrows again. From the structure of belief to the physical world that bore its consequences. Because whatever the final war was, it left marks not only in story, but in soil, stone, and silence. The physical world remembers differently than stories do. It does not interpret. It does not justify. It simply holds what happened, layered beneath what came later. In the lands once occupied by the earliest cities, there are interruptions in the ground that refuse easy explanation. Burn layers without signs of siege, sudden abandonment without gradual decline, settlements that vanish and do not return for generations. Archaeology describes these moments carefully, often cautiously. A destruction layer, a hiatus in occupation, evidence of environmental stress. Each term is precise but emotionally neutral. The soil does not speculate. It only testifies that something disrupted continuity hard enough to stop life where it had previously flourished. What is striking is not that collapse occurred. Collapse is common in human history. What is striking is how often these interruptions coincide with the period when the texts themselves grow anxious. When lamentations proliferate, when stories of divine withdrawal cluster, when cosmology hardens into hierarchy. This convergence does not prove causation, but it invites attention. Text and terrain seem to echo one another. Where the tablets speak of cities emptied, the ground shows abandonment. Where the texts describe land that no longer produces, the archaeological record shows shifts in agriculture, changes in crop patterns, or long pauses before resettlement. In some places, rebuilding happens quickly. In others, it does not happen at all. The unevenness matters. It suggests that whatever occurred did not affect all regions equally. Some areas recovered, Others were left altered long enough for memory to calcify into myth. The ancient writers noticed this unevenness too. They did not speak of a single destruction sweeping the entire world at once. They spoke of cities falling in sequence, of favor moving from one place to another, of gods choosing to stay in one city while abandoning the next. This is not the language of a single explosion. It is the language of cascading failure. Environmental systems are particularly sensitive to such cascades. Irrigation networks require constant maintenance. Once disrupted, they can turn fertile land saline or barren within a few seasons. The texts are acutely aware of this. Canals are mentioned as lifelines. Their failure is synonymous with death. When the gods are said to withdraw, what may be withdrawing in practical terms is coordination. Labor no longer arrives where it is needed. Repairs are delayed. Water flows incorrectly. The land itself becomes hostile, not through malice, but through neglect. This is how catastrophe can feel supernatural to those living through it. The systems that once worked simply stop responding. No prayer fixes a broken canal. No offering reverses salinization. From within the experience, it feels as though the governing powers have turned away. The final war, viewed through this lens, may not have been a single moment of devastation, but the breakdown of the systems that kept devastation at bay. War among the gods would then be the mythic language for a loss of coordination at the highest level. A failure of oversight that allowed smaller failures to compound until cities fell silent. This interpretation does not diminish the ancient accounts. It deepens them. It suggests that the people who wrote these tablets were not inventing disaster. They were living inside it, searching for a framework large enough to explain why the world they depended on had stopped behaving as it should. As we move forward, we turn toward the most unsettling implication of all, that the final war may not have been remembered because it was extraordinary, but because it was systemic. And systems, once broken in a certain way, tend to break again unless something fundamental changes. Systemic failure leaves a different kind of scar than sudden catastrophe. It does not arrive all at once. It unfolds. It creates moments of hope, followed by deeper collapse. Repairs are attempted. Authority is reasserted. Life resumes, briefly, before slipping again. To those living through it, the danger is not obvious until it is already everywhere. The ancient texts capture this rhythm without naming it. They speak of restoration after destruction, followed by renewed lament. Of gods returning to cities only to depart again, of kings rebuilding temples that will soon stand empty. The repetition is not poetic. It is diagnostic. What makes systemic collapse so difficult to remember clearly is that it resists narrative closure. There is no single villain, no decisive victory. Responsibility is distributed, diluted, and therefore hard to confront. Myth steps in where history falters, not to deceive, but to stabilize meaning. In this sense, the final war may have been less about weapons than about governance reaching its limit. A network of divine authority, mirrored by human administration, stretched too far across too many cities, too many people, too many dependencies. When coordination failed at the center, the periphery unraveled. The gods in these texts function as nodes in a system. Each governs a domain. Each depends on the others to maintain balance. When disputes arise, the system absorbs them for a time. But once disputes multiply, the strain becomes visible. Decisions conflict. Orders overlap. Responsibility blurs. For humans on the ground, the experience is indistinguishable from divine hostility. Crops fail. Floods come at the wrong time. Protection disappears. Whether the gods are angry, absent, or divided makes little practical difference. The result is the same. This ambiguity is what allows memory to transform failure into conflict. A breakdown in coordination becomes a war among gods. A loss of oversight becomes divine abandonment. These metaphors are not exaggerations. They are the most accurate descriptions available to those without modern systems language. The sobering implication is that the final war did not end because someone won. It ended because the system retracted. Complexity was reduced. Authority was centralized. Distance replaced intimacy. The world became simpler, harsher, and more manageable. Civilization survived by shrinking its expectations. Gods withdrew. Humans ruled smaller territories. Ambitions were constrained. The grand interconnected world imagined in earlier periods gave way to regional stability and localized power. This was not failure. It was adaptation. But adaptation carries memory. The caution embedded in later law codes, the fear of excess in later myths, the reverence for precedent in later politics, all trace back to this contraction. A lesson learned once, at devastating cost. As we approach the heart of the ancient fear, one realization becomes unavoidable. The final war was not remembered because it was unique. It was remembered because it revealed a truth that remains uncomfortable even now. That systems designed to bring order can, under enough strain, become indistinguishable from the forces of destruction they were meant to prevent. Once that realization takes hold, the ancient world begins to look less alien and more intimate. The fear preserved in the tablets is not of monsters or invaders, but of complexity turning against itself, of systems becoming so interdependent that a failure in one domain cascades into every other. The gods in this reading are not merely characters. They are placeholders for forces that must remain coordinated for life to continue. Water, fertility, weather, authority, labor. When these forces align, cities thrive. When they diverge, no single action can repair the damage. Appeals fail because there is no single ear listening. This helps explain why the texts emphasize councils so strongly. Decisions are collective, responsibility is shared. When consensus holds, the world functions. When it breaks, there is no override. The system lacks redundancy. It collapses inward. The final war, then, marks the moment when consensus failed at the highest level, when the coordinating mechanism itself became contested. Whether this was experienced as divine disagreement, political fragmentation, or environmental mismanagement matters less than the outcome. The center could no longer hold. In response, later civilizations reduce reliance on consensus and increase reliance on hierarchy. One king, one law, one chain of command. This sacrifices flexibility, but it restores predictability. The risk of catastrophic disagreement is lowered by narrowing who can decide. This shift has consequences. It stabilizes societies, but it also hardens them. Dissent becomes threat. Diversity becomes risk. The lesson of the final war is learned too well. Fear of fracture justifies control. The ancient writers do not celebrate this outcome. They endure it. Their tone remains subdued, almost resigned. The world continues, but it is not the same world that existed when gods walked openly among cities and decisions could still be argued face to face. In this quieter world, memory becomes heavier. Without direct divine presence, the past carries more authority. Precedent replaces conversation. What was done before becomes the safest guide for what should be done now. This is why the tablets were copied so meticulously. Preservation was not nostalgia, it was strategy. Forgetting risked repetition. Remembering, even imperfectly, was a form of defense. The final war thus achieves its most lasting effect, not through destruction, but through discipline. It disciplines imagination. It disciplines ambition. It disciplines the relationship between humanity and the forces it believes govern existence. And yet, discipline is not resolution. The underlying tensions remain. Systems still strain. Authority still concentrates. complexity still grows. The ancient memory does not promise immunity. It offers only awareness. As we continue, the narrative turns toward the most haunting aspect of all, not what the final war destroyed, but what it left unfinished. The questions it could not answer, the balance it could not permanently restore, and the quiet understanding that no system, divine or human, escapes the limits imposed by its own design. What the final war left unfinished is felt most strongly in the spaces where certainty should exist, but does not. The texts never quite explain how stability is guaranteed. They describe how it is restored, how it is enforced, how it is symbolized, but not how it is made permanent. This absence is not accidental. It reflects an understanding that permanence itself may be an illusion. In the ancient worldview, order is always provisional. It holds because it is maintained, not because it is inevitable. The gods do not create a self-sustaining system. They supervise one. When supervision falters, order decays. This insight lingers beneath every later attempt at control. The final war exposes this vulnerability too clearly to forget. Even when authority is centralized and hierarchy imposed, the possibility of fracture remains. The tablet of destinies can be stolen. The king can fail. The canal can silt up. The storm can come at the wrong time. No seal is absolute. This is why later texts emphasize vigilance. Watch the skies. Read the signs. Keep the rituals exact. These practices are not expressions of superstition. They are expressions of anxiety born from experience. When the world once slipped out of alignment, no one wants to be unprepared again. Yet vigilance has limits. It can slow collapse, but it cannot eliminate risk. The ancients seem to have understood this, even if they could not articulate it in abstract terms. Their stories acknowledge failure as a recurring possibility. Order is restored, but always with the implication that it could be lost again. The final war, then, functions as a horizon rather than a point in time. It marks the edge of acceptable disorder. Beyond it lies unthinkable breakdown. Every subsequent crisis is measured against that memory, even when its details have faded. For humanity, this creates a paradoxical inheritance. The more one tries to prevent collapse, the more one becomes aware of how fragile stability truly is. Confidence gives way to caution. Innovation gives way to preservation. The future is approached with restraint. This restraint is visible in how ancient cultures treat knowledge. Certain information is restricted. Certain practices are guarded, not because they are sacred in the abstract, but because misuse could destabilize the system. Knowledge itself becomes a force that must be regulated. In this sense, the final war is also a story about limits. Limits on growth, limits on power, limits on access. It teaches that unchecked expansion leads not to mastery, but to breakdown. That coordination, once lost, is painfully difficult to restore. As we move forward into the last phase of this long memory, the tone begins to soften, not because the danger has passed, but because the ancients learned how to live with uncertainty. They accepted that order is temporary, that vigilance is necessary, and that forgetting entirely is impossible. What remains is a quiet, enduring awareness. The world holds together not by accident, but by care. And care, once learned through catastrophe, becomes the most ancient form of wisdom. Living with uncertainty reshapes the way time itself is felt. The ancient texts begin to measure existence not by progress, but by continuity. To endure becomes the highest achievement. To persist without repeating catastrophe becomes success. This shift is subtle, but it permeates everything. The gods, once described as innovators and builders, now appear as guardians and enforcers. Their creative acts recede into the distant past. Their present role is maintenance. They watch, they judge, they correct. Creation becomes something dangerous to repeat. Stability is safer than invention. Human societies mirror this change. Grand experiments give way to refinement. Systems are optimized rather than reinvented. Tradition becomes authority. What has worked before is trusted more than what might work better. The fear beneath this conservatism is clear. Change risks imbalance. Imbalance risks collapse. The final war thus casts a long shadow over imagination itself. It teaches restraint not only in action, but in thought. To imagine too boldly is to risk forgetting the cost of failure. The ancient world chooses memory over possibility. Yet this choice is not absolute. Curiosity persists, but it moves underground. It survives in priestly schools, in restricted texts, in careful observation of the heavens. Knowledge advances quietly, wrapped in reverence and caution. Innovation is permitted only when it can be framed as rediscovery. This tension between curiosity and restraint produces a culture of deep observation. The skies are mapped, the seasons are tracked, numbers are refined, writing evolves. These are not the acts of a civilization afraid of knowledge. They are the acts of one afraid of misuse. The final war, remembered as a systemic failure, transforms wisdom into something defensive. Wisdom is no longer about expanding reach. It is about preventing error. The wise person is not the one who dares most, but the one who maintains balance. This ethos carries forward for centuries. It shapes legal traditions that prioritize precedent, religious systems that emphasize orthodoxy, political structures that resist decentralization. The memory of collapse becomes a stabilizing force, but also a limiting one. And still, beneath this discipline, the unresolved question remains. If the final war was the result of complexity exceeding coordination, then what happens when complexity inevitably grows again? The ancients sensed this tension, even if they could not resolve it. They responded not with denial, but with humility. The texts do not promise eternal stability. They promise only guidance. Observe the signs, respect the limits, remember what happened before. As we approach the final arc of this narrative, that humility becomes central. The ancient world does not offer certainty. It offers perspective, a reminder that order is fragile, that power must be handled carefully, and that the greatest danger often arises not from outside threats, but from the structures we build to protect ourselves. Humility is perhaps the most unexpected legacy of the ancient catastrophe. Not humility as submission, but humility as awareness. An understanding that no system, no authority, no intelligence is immune to the consequences of its own design. This awareness does not paralyze action, it tempers it. In the later layers of Mesopotamian thought, the gods themselves are bound by limits. They swear oaths, they consult omens, they hesitate. This is not weakness, it is recognition. The memory of failure has taught restraint even to those who once ruled without question. For humans, this shared restraint creates a strange form of kinship. The distance between mortal and divine remains vast, but the vulnerability feels familiar. Both are subject to imbalance. Both must operate within constraints. Both can trigger catastrophe through miscalculation. The final war, in this light, becomes a lesson written into the fabric of existence. Not a tale of punishment, but of consequence. Actions propagate. Systems respond. Outcomes emerge that no single participant intended. Responsibility becomes collective, whether acknowledged or not. This collective responsibility is difficult to sustain. It requires patience, coordination, and trust. The ancient world learned how easily those qualities erode, how quickly pressure turns cooperation into conflict, how fast survival instincts override long-term thinking. The stories that survive from this period reflect that tension. They praise wisdom over strength, counsel over impulse, balance over dominance. These values are not idealistic. They are pragmatic. They emerge from lived experience of what happens when power outruns judgment. And yet, even with humility, the risk does not vanish. The ancient texts do not claim to have solved the problem of stability. They only claim to have survived it. The final war is not portrayed as an end point, but as a warning etched deep enough to shape behavior for millennia. This is why the narrative never offers closure. There is no final victory, no restored golden age. The world that follows is workable but imperfect. It demands ongoing attention. Order must be renewed continuously or it will decay. As the story moves toward its final reflection, the emphasis shifts again, from what the ancients endured to what they entrusted to the future, because writing, in the end, was their answer to impermanence. Clay was chosen not for beauty, but for durability. They pressed their memory into the earth so that it would outlast them, not as a monument, but as a caution. A quiet message to whoever might one day read it, long after the names of the gods had faded, long after the cities had turned to dust. That message is simple and difficult. Pay attention. Remember that systems break. Remember that authority divides. Remember that survival depends not on strength alone, but on balance carefully maintained. And if that memory feels uncomfortably relevant, it is because it was never meant to stay in the past. By the time the memory reaches us, it has passed through countless hands and countless decisions about what to keep and what to let fade. And yet what survives does not feel accidental. The core unease remains intact, as if it were the very thing the ancients most wanted to preserve. The final war, as it lingers in these texts, is not a spectacle. It is a threshold, a moment when the illusion of automatic order dissolved and the responsibility for maintaining balance became unmistakably conscious. After that point, ignorance was no longer possible, only forgetting. For the ancient writers, forgetting was the greater danger. Not because it erased the past, but because it invited repetition. To forget that systems fail is to trust them blindly. To forget that authority fractures is to assume unity where none is guaranteed. To forget that complexity demands coordination is to court collapse again. This is why the texts are so careful to sound calm even when describing devastation. Panic does not preserve memory. Precision does. A measured tone allows the lesson to endure without overwhelming the listener. The goal is not to terrify, but to instruct quietly. In the end, the gods recede not because they are defeated, but because proximity itself has become risky. Distance becomes a safety measure. Humans step forward not as replacements, but as caretakers of a world that has learned its own limits. The final war leaves no monument, no single scar that can be pointed to and named. Its true legacy is architectural. It shapes how cities are planned, how authority is structured, how stories are told, and how power is justified. It lives in the spaces between decisions, in the caution that tempers ambition, and perhaps that is why this memory still resonates. Because it does not belong exclusively to an ancient world of clay tablets and vanished gods. It belongs to any moment when systems grow vast, when coordination strains, when decisions made at the center ripple outward faster than they can be corrected. The ancients did not claim to have mastered this problem. They claimed only to have seen it clearly once, at immense cost. And they chose to leave behind a record, not of triumph, but of awareness. As the narrative begins to slow, as it prepares to release its grip, one final realization settles gently into place. The final war was not the end of something external. It was the end of certainty. And what followed was not darkness, but responsibility. A responsibility carried forward in silence, in ritual, in law. in memory, waiting for each new generation to decide whether it will listen closely enough to hear what the past is still, very patiently, trying to say. When certainty ends, interpretation begins. The ancient world did not respond to this loss by clinging to literal memory alone. It began to think symbolically, not as an escape, but as a way to hold multiple truths at once. What could no longer be remembered as direct experience became encoded as pattern, cycle, and sky. This is where interpretation enters the story, not as modern speculation, but as an ancient survival strategy. The gods, once administrators of the earth, begin to mirror the heavens. Their conflicts align with celestial movements. Their authority is mapped onto stars, planets, and recurring rhythms. What broke on the ground is reorganized above. Astronomy becomes more than observation. It becomes reassurance. The sky moves with discipline. The planets follow paths. Eclipses can be anticipated. If the heavens obey cycles, then perhaps history does too. Perhaps catastrophe is not random but periodic, and if it is periodic, it might be endured. The idea of cosmic cycles grows slowly but persistently. Ages are born. Ages decline. Ages end. Floods, fires, and wars become punctuation marks in a longer sentence rather than full stops. This framework does not erase fear, but it gives it boundaries. Even disaster has a place. In this interpretive layer, the final war transforms again. It becomes not just a historical memory, but a marker between cycles, a transition from one mode of existence to another. The age when gods ruled directly gives way to the age when humans interpret signs. This shift has profound consequences. Meaning is no longer located in divine presence, but in timing. Knowing when becomes as important as knowing why. Calendars, omens, and astronomical records proliferate. Time itself becomes the mediator between heaven and earth. Speculation enters quietly here. If cycles govern the cosmos, then collapse may be inevitable, but also survivable. Preparation replaces prevention. The goal is not to stop the cycle, but to pass through it with memory intact. This is why ancient cultures invest so heavily in record-keeping. Tablets are copied. Lists are maintained. Kings are catalogued. Floods are remembered. Each record is an attempt to anchor the present within a larger pattern that stretches backward and forward beyond any single lifetime. The final war, in this view, is both unique and inevitable. Unique in its expression. Inevitable in its function. It resets, not because it must, but because systems left unchecked tend toward imbalance. The war becomes the mechanism through which imbalance is corrected. Whether this interpretation reflects literal belief or symbolic reasoning is less important than its psychological effect. It allows a traumatized civilization to breathe again, to accept uncertainty without surrendering meaning. As we continue, this cyclical thinking will carry us beyond Mesopotamia, beyond the Anunnaki, into later cultures that inherit the same unease and reinterpret it through their own skies, their own gods, their own endings. As the idea of cycles travels outward from Mesopotamia, it does not remain intact. It adapts. Each culture that inherits it reshapes the pattern to fit its own landscape, its own fears, its own memory of collapse. What stays consistent is not the imagery, but the logic beneath it. Ages rise and fall. Worlds are destroyed and remade. Gods battle, retreat, or transform. Humanity survives, diminished but persistent. These motifs appear again and again, separated by geography but linked by structure. The names change. The sky remains. What began as a memory of divine fracture becomes, over time, a universal grammar for catastrophe. Fire from heaven, flood from the deep, darkness at noon, land rendered sterile, survivors carrying knowledge into a quieter world. These are not identical stories, but they rhyme in ways that suggest shared inheritance rather than coincidence. In these later traditions, the final war often becomes a war of succession. An older order gives way to a younger one. Authority shifts hands. The victorious gods reorganize the cosmos and establish new rules. This narrative resolves the anxiety left unresolved in the older texts. Someone wins. Unity is restored, the system works again, but the need for such resolution reveals the fear beneath it. The older Mesopotamian memory did not promise victory, it promised survival. Later cultures seem less willing to accept that ambiguity. They want closure, they want a champion, they want assurance that order will not fracture again. Even so, the pattern betrays itself. Each new order is described as stable, yet temporary. Another age will end. Another conflict will come. The cycle continues. Certainty remains elusive. Humanity's role in these later retellings also shifts. No longer merely laborers or witnesses, humans become participants in cosmic renewal. They preserve knowledge. They repopulate the world. They carry the memory of the previous age forward, even when that memory is fragmented or symbolic. This elevation of humanity may be the most profound transformation of all. After the final war, humans are no longer peripheral to cosmic stability. They are part of its maintenance. Their actions matter. Their choices affect alignment. This idea carries a subtle burden. If humanity is now woven into the cycle, then failure is no longer exclusively divine. Responsibility is shared. Collapse is not something that only happens to the world. It is something the world participates in. The ancient fear thus evolves into a quieter, more personal awareness. The gods may withdraw, but the pattern remains. Systems rise, systems strain, systems fail. Memory is the only defense against repetition. As we move further into interpretation and theory, the question sharpens once more. If cycles are real, whether literal or symbolic, what governs their timing? And how did ancient cultures attempt to read the signs of an ending before it arrived? To read the signs of an ending is to accept that endings have signatures. The ancient world believed this deeply. Nothing ended without warning. The sky spoke first. The land answered second. Humanity noticed last. In Mesopotamia, this belief shaped an extraordinary attentiveness to patterns. Astronomical cycles were not curiosities, they were diagnostics. Planetary retrogrades, eclipses, irregular risings of stars were treated as disturbances in a cosmic routine that normally held steady. When the routine faltered, memory stirred. The final war, reframed through this lens, becomes the ultimate anomaly, a moment when all indicators failed at once. The sky did not warn clearly enough. The gods did not intervene in time. The land responded with devastation. Afterward, no sign could be taken lightly again. This is why omen literature becomes so dense and meticulous. Thousands of recorded observations, each paired with outcomes, each preserved as data rather than poetry. The effort is almost desperate. If catastrophe follows patterns, then those patterns must be mapped exhaustively. Nothing can be left unobserved. Yet even with this vigilance, uncertainty persists. Omens contradict each other. Signs overlap. Interpretation becomes contested. The ancient texts acknowledge this confusion quietly. Diviners argue. Councils disagree. The system strains under the weight of its own complexity once more. This recurrence is unsettling. It suggests that the final war did not eliminate the conditions that led to collapse. It merely taught awareness of them. Complexity continues to grow. Coordination remains fragile. The risk never disappears. Some traditions respond by projecting the next catastrophe far into the future. Others bring it close, warning that the end is always imminent. Both approaches serve the same function. They keep attention sharp. They prevent complacency. In this way, the memory of the final war becomes temporal rather than historical. It is no longer anchored to a specific past, but to a potential future, a reminder that collapse is not behind us. It is ahead of us, waiting for the right conditions. This is where speculation becomes inevitable. If ancient cultures believed that cycles governed collapse, then they also believed those cycles could be calculated. The sky, after all, moves predictably. If catastrophe aligns with celestial rhythms, then timing becomes knowable. Some later interpretations push this idea to its limits. They imagine wandering stars, long periods, great returns. The final war becomes one phase in a much longer cosmic cycle that includes creation, expansion, correction, and reset. Whether these ideas were literal beliefs or symbolic frameworks matters less than their emotional function. They transform fear into expectation. The unknown becomes scheduled. Anxiety becomes preparation. And yet, beneath this preparation lies a quieter truth. Knowing that collapse may come does not tell you how to stop it. It only tells you to watch. As the narrative moves toward its final reflections, that act of watching becomes central. Watching the sky, watching power, watching systems for the first signs of strain. The ancient texts do not promise salvation. They promise awareness. And awareness, once learned the hard way, becomes the last inheritance of a world that survived its own undoing. Watching, in the ancient sense, was never passive. It was an act of responsibility. To observe was to participate. To notice imbalance early was to give the system a chance, however small, to correct itself before collapse became unavoidable. This is why the Watcher occupies such a strange position in later traditions. The priest, the scribe, the diviner. These figures are not powerful in the way kings are powerful. They do not command armies or decree laws. Their influence lies in attention, in interpretation, in warning. After the final war, attention becomes a form of defense. The world is no longer trusted to run itself. Someone must always be listening for the first sign of strain. Someone must remember what those signs once led to. Yet watching also carries a burden. To see imbalance forming and be unable to stop it is its own kind of torment. The ancient texts hint at this quietly. Diviners who speak warnings that are ignored. Priests who perform rituals knowing they may not be enough. Scribes who record omens without knowing how they will be interpreted. The system demands vigilance, but it does not guarantee agency. Awareness does not equal control. This tension runs through the later layers of myth like a low current. Knowledge increases. Power does not necessarily follow. The final war thus casts a double shadow. It teaches the importance of awareness, but it also teaches the limits of foresight. The sky can be read, but not commanded. Patterns can be recognized, but not always altered. Collapse can be anticipated, but not always prevented. This is perhaps the most sobering lesson of all. That intelligence alone is insufficient. That even a system aware of its own fragility may still fail if coordination breaks down at critical moments. In response, ancient cultures place immense value on continuity of memory. If collapse cannot always be prevented, it can at least be remembered accurately. Memory becomes the last line of defense against total repetition. This is why writing itself becomes sacred. Clay tablets are not just records, they are stabilizers. Each copied text is an act of resistance against forgetting, against the erasure that allows mistakes to be repeated without warning. The final war, preserved through this lens, becomes a reference model, not a prophecy, but a pattern, a way to recognize when the world begins to resemble a moment that once nearly ended it. As the narrative moves toward its closing phase, this pattern takes precedence over all names and myths. Whether gods or humans, stars or kings, the lesson remains consistent. Systems do not collapse suddenly. They signal first, they strain, they fracture, and only then do they fall. The ancient world listened for those signals with extraordinary care. The question that remains, suspended gently at the edge of the story, is whether later worlds learned to listen with the same patience. Patience, in this context, is not calm acceptance. It is sustained attention over long spans of time. The kind of attention that notices slow drift rather than sudden change. The ancients understood that collapse rarely announces itself loudly at first. It whispers. It appears as minor irregularities that are easy to dismiss. A canal silts a little faster than usual. A harvest arrives slightly late. A ruler ignores a warning because nothing bad happened last time. Each moment seems isolated. Together, they form a pattern that only becomes visible when viewed across years, even generations. This is why ancient memory stretches backward so insistently. King lists extend into impossibly long reigns. Myths reach into primordial time. These exaggerations are not naive. They are attempts to widen perspective, to force the listener to think beyond a single lifetime, beyond the comfort of short-term success. The final war becomes the ultimate long view, a reminder that what feels stable now may only be stable because past generations absorbed the cost of earlier failures. The present inherits not just order, but the consequences of how that order was achieved. In this sense, patience is ethical. It demands responsibility for outcomes that may not be visible immediately. The ancients struggled with this. Their texts record repeated moments when short-term solutions created long-term damage. The flood solves one problem but introduces another. Centralization restores order but suppresses flexibility. These trade-offs are not hidden. They are acknowledged quietly, without resolution. The world continues not because it is perfect, but because it is bearable. Stability is measured not by justice, but by endurance. This endurance, however, depends on memory being carried forward accurately enough to remain useful. When memory becomes ritualized without being understood, its protective function weakens. The form survives, the meaning thins. The final war haunts this process. It is remembered just clearly enough to shape behavior, but not clearly enough to be questioned openly. This creates a fragile balance. Too much clarity risks destabilizing belief. Too little risks repetition. The ancient solution was narration, stories slow enough to absorb, repetition gentle enough to settle into the mind without provoking fear, memory encoded as rhythm rather than alarm. As we approach the final stretch of this narrative, the rhythm begins to change. The urgency fades. The emphasis shifts from warning to reflection, not because the danger has passed, but because the listener has learned how to listen. The ancients did not expect to prevent every collapse. They hoped only to recognize the signs early enough to respond with care rather than panic. That hope, pressed into clay and carried across millennia, becomes the quiet inheritance we now hold in our hands. Reflection is the space where urgency dissolves into understanding. By this point in the ancient narrative, the question is no longer how to stop collapse, but how to live knowing it is possible. This shift is subtle, but it changes everything. The final war, once feared as an ending, becomes a teacher. Not a gentle one, but a thorough one. It teaches that permanence is not a feature of the world. It is a temporary condition created by alignment, maintenance, and restraint. When those fail, nothing intervenes automatically to save what exists. The ancients did not respond to this knowledge with despair. They responded with depth. They layered meaning. They slowed time. They embedded reminders into calendars, rituals, and stories that repeated just often enough to remain present without becoming overwhelming. This is why the tone of the surviving texts is so measured. They do not scream warnings because screaming exhausts attention. They speak quietly because quiet lasts. A calm voice can be returned to again and again, each time revealing something new. The gods, in these later reflections, are no longer simply agents of catastrophe or order. They are mirrors. They reflect human struggles with power, coordination, and responsibility. Their conflicts externalize dilemmas that every complex system eventually faces. In this sense, the final war is less about divine failure than about universal limits. No structure can grow indefinitely without strain. No authority can expand without creating tension. No solution remains perfect once conditions change. The ancient world accepted this with a realism that feels almost modern. They did not expect utopia. They expected fluctuation. Their goal was not to eliminate risk, but to navigate it with memory intact. This acceptance reshapes their idea of wisdom. Wisdom is no longer about mastery. It is about proportion, knowing how much is enough, knowing when to stop, knowing when to preserve rather than expand. The stories that follow the final war reinforce this lesson gently. Heroes who push too far fall. Kings who ignore warnings lose favor. Gods who overreach are corrected. These outcomes are not framed as moral failures, but as miscalculations. The listener is not asked to fear power, but to respect it, not to reject ambition, but to temper it. The ancient texts do not condemn growth. They caution against unbalanced growth. As we move toward the final reflections, the narrative grows quieter still. The need to explain fades. What remains is perspective, a long view that holds destruction and continuity in the same frame without demanding resolution. The final war, seen from this distance, is no longer an event to decode. It is a lens, a way of seeing the world that recognizes fragility without surrendering to it. And that lens, once formed, does not belong to the past alone. Once a lens is formed, it quietly reshapes everything that passes through it. The ancient listener did not need the final war explained again. They carried its outline in the way they understood seasons, authority, and loss. It was present without being named. By this stage in the tradition, the gods function almost like boundary markers. They define limits rather than possibilities. Their myths do not invite imitation. They invite restraint. Each story becomes a reminder that power, once accumulated, demands care equal to its scale. This is why the most enduring figures are not conquerors, but keepers. Gods of wisdom, record, measure, and balance rise in prominence. Their value lies not in what they destroy or create, but in what they prevent from tipping too far. Preservation becomes sacred. Human life mirrors this shift. The ideal ruler is no longer the one who expands endlessly, but the one who maintains. The ideal city is not the largest, but the most stable. Greatness is measured in longevity rather than spectacle. The final war recedes further into abstraction here, but it does not weaken. It becomes a quiet constraint on imagination, a sense that there are thresholds which, once crossed, cannot be uncrossed, that some victories cost more than they are worth. This awareness produces a subtle ethics of enough land, enough labor, enough authority. Excess is no longer impressive. It is suspicious. The memory of collapse has taught that growth without coordination is simply delay before correction. The ancient texts do not frame this as resignation. They frame it as maturity. A civilization that has seen too much to believe in simple answers learns to value balance over triumph. And yet, even this maturity carries sadness. The earlier world, for all its danger, was closer. God spoke. Boundaries were thinner. The later world is safer, but lonelier. The sky is orderly but distant. Meaning must be sought rather than received. This quiet grief is present in the laments that continue long after cities are rebuilt. They mourn not only destruction, but distance. Not only loss of life, but loss of intimacy with the forces that once felt responsive. The final war, then, is also a story of separation. A world divided from its sense of immediate belonging. Humanity steps into responsibility, but at the cost of closeness. As the narrative approaches its end, this tension remains unresolved. Safety and distance, stability and loss, memory and forgetting. The ancient world does not choose between them. It learns to live with all of them at once, and in doing so, it leaves behind not a conclusion, but a posture, a way of standing in time with awareness, humility, and care. Standing in time this way changes how endings are understood. They are no longer points of collapse, but transitions into quieter modes of existence. The ancient world did not expect the past to return in its original form. It expected echoes, patterns repeating with variations, lessons resurfacing when conditions aligned. The final war, seen from this distance, becomes an initiation rather than a catastrophe, a passage through which civilization learned what it could no longer afford to ignore. After it, innocence was gone, but awareness remained. That awareness became the foundation of everything that followed. The gods, now distant, are not absent. They are diffused. Their authority is embedded in laws, seasons, and shared memory. Their conflicts are no longer enacted openly, but absorbed into structure. The sky is quieter because its arguments have been settled into rules. Humanity inherits a world that works, but only if watched, only if tended, only if remembered. The ancient texts never suggest that vigilance can be relaxed permanently. They suggest instead that vigilance must become habitual, woven into daily life so completely that it feels natural. This habit of attention is the final refinement of wisdom. It does not rely on fear, though fear once taught it. It relies on familiarity with fragility, on knowing how easily alignment can be lost when convenience replaces care. The final war is no longer something to dread. It is something to understand. A demonstration of scale, a reminder that forces capable of sustaining civilization are also capable of dismantling it when coordination fails. In this understanding, there is a quiet dignity. The ancient world does not ask to be rescued from uncertainty. It asks only to be allowed to navigate it with memory intact, to pass forward what it learned without dramatization. As the narrative begins to release its hold, one last idea settles gently, that the most enduring inheritance of the ancient catastrophe is not fear, but attentiveness, a way of listening to the world closely enough to notice when balance begins to shift. And perhaps that is why these texts still invite return, not because they promise answers, but because they cultivate a state of mind, calm, observant, aware of cycles without being trapped by them. The final war, then, does not end the story. It teaches how to remain present within it. Presence, once learned, becomes its own form of continuity. The ancient world did not expect resolution in the modern sense. It expected endurance. To remain present through change was the achievement. To notice shifts without panic was the discipline. To carry memory without being consumed by it was the art. In this final phase, the story no longer looks backward alone. It looks outward, toward whoever is listening. The tablets, once tools of administration and ritual, become companions. They do not instruct directly. They sit beside you, patient, waiting to be noticed again. The final war fades here into something quieter still. It becomes a shared understanding between past and present. That complexity demands care, That authority requires coordination. That silence can be as meaningful as speech. These are not dramatic insights. They are enduring ones. What the ancients leave behind is not a warning shouted across time, but a posture of attention, a way of inhabiting uncertainty without rushing to dominate it, a reminder that the world is not fragile because it is weak, but because it is interconnected. This awareness does not eliminate danger. It reframes it. Collapse is no longer an incomprehensible shock. It is a process that can be watched, slowed, sometimes redirected, sometimes simply endured with dignity. The gods, now almost indistinguishable from principles, still serve their purpose. They remind us that forces larger than individuals shape outcomes, that humility before scale is not submission, but realism, that cooperation is not idealism, but necessity. As the narrative softens, it invites rest rather than conclusion. The ancient world does not close the book. It leaves it open, pages weighted with clay and time, waiting for hands willing to turn them slowly. In that openness, the final war becomes less important than what followed it, not rebuilding alone, but learning. Not victory, but awareness. Not certainty, but care. And perhaps that is enough. Enough does not mean complete. It means sufficient to continue. The ancient world understood this distinction deeply. Completion implies finality. Sufficiency implies balance. The goal was never to finish the story, but to keep it from unraveling. The texts settle into this understanding with remarkable calm. There is no demand that the listener agree, no insistence on belief, only an offering of perspective shaped by endurance rather than triumph. The final war, now far behind, leaves behind a quieter inheritance, a sense that the world must be handled gently because it has been broken before, that power must be coordinated because it once fragmented. That memory must be carried because forgetting proved costly. This inheritance does not belong to priests or kings alone. It belongs to anyone who listens long enough to feel the rhythm beneath the words, the slow pulse of rise and correction, the breathing in and out of order and strain. What the ancients preserved was not data alone, but tempo, a pace of thought slow enough to notice accumulation before collapse, a tone calm enough to absorb fear without amplifying it. As the story draws nearer to silence, it invites the listener to rest inside that tempo, to feel the long view, to recognize that living within systems requires patience more than certainty, awareness more than control. The final war no longer needs to be named. Its lesson has dissolved into the way the story ends, gently, without final answers, with room to return. This is how memory survives without becoming burden. It softens, it spreads, it becomes part of how one stands in time. And so the ancient voice recedes, not into disappearance, but into background, like the night wind, like the movement of stars, always present, rarely demanding, waiting to be noticed again. In the quiet that follows, reflection deepens rather than closes. The ancient world leaves us with no monument to catastrophe, no single image to hold on to. Instead, it leaves a way of seeing, a way of listening. The final war, once feared as an ending, now feels like a turning inward, a moment when the world learned to speak more softly because shouting had failed, when endurance replaced certainty as the measure of success. This softness is not weakness, it is refinement. A civilization that survives its own undoing learns to value subtlety. It learns that the most dangerous changes are often the least dramatic at first. That care must be continuous, not reactive. The listener now becomes part of this lineage, not by agreement, but by attention. To listen is to participate in the same act of preservation that shaped these texts in the first place. Nothing is required beyond that. No belief, no conclusion. Only the willingness to remain present with uncertainty without rushing to fill it. The final war rests where it belongs now, not as spectacle, not as proof, but as a remembered threshold that reshaped how the world learned to continue. And perhaps that is why these stories are suited to the quiet hours. They do not demand wakefulness. They invite awareness without tension. They allow the mind to rest while the deeper pattern remains. The ancient world understood that some truths are best carried gently, not pressed into argument, but allowed to settle over time. In that spirit, the story loosens its grip. The words grow fewer. The meaning remains. And now, there is nothing left to pursue. Only what has already been placed gently in your care. The memory of a world that once fractured and learned slowly how to stand again. The understanding that stability is not given, but tended. That systems endure not because they are strong, but because they are watched. The final war dissolves here into silence, not because it was insignificant, but because it has already done its work. It taught attention. It taught restraint. It taught the value of remembering without clinging. What remains is a calm awareness that cycles continue, that balance must be renewed, and that listening is itself a form of participation. The ancient voice does not ask anything of you. It does not warn. It does not persuade. It simply remains like a low horizon, reminding you that the present moment, too, will one day become memory. And so the story ends the way it always was meant to end, not with certainty, but with continuity, a quiet passing forward of awareness, and the gentle understanding that the night, like history, is not empty. It is full of things still listening,